On a freezing Christmas Eve, while the city glowed with lights and laughter, a mother sat in a diner counting the last dollars in her wallet. Her children were hungry, her hands were shaking, and the people around her saw but chose not to care. What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic at first, but it exposed a quiet kind of racism, one built on judgment, silence, and whose society decides is invisible. And then, a single decision from an unexpected stranger changed the entire room. Was it kindness, or something much deeper that forced everyone to confront the truth? Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe to our channel Stories of Racism and connect with us for daily powerful stories, because tomorrow we've got something extra special for you. Before that night, Sarah Mitchell's life was built on routines, small, fragile routines that kept everything from falling apart. She woke before dawn each morning in a cramped Atlanta apartment where the heat worked only when it felt like it. She dressed quietly so she wouldn't wake her daughters, Maya and Zoe, twins who still slept pressed close together for warmth. She checked the clock, checked the bills on the counter, checked her phone for missed calls from work. Every day began the same way, with calculation, worry, and the quiet promise that somehow she would make it through one more day. Sarah was 32, though exhaustion had aged her beyond her years. She worked as a nursing assistant at an understaffed hospital, a job that demanded long hours, aching muscles, and endless patience. She lifted strangers from beds, cleaned wounds, and held hands in moments of fear, then went home to her own worries waiting for her. Since her husband's death 3 years earlier, there had been no safety net, no second income, no one to catch her when things went wrong. Only her determination and the 2 little girls who depended on her for everything. Maya and Zoe were 7 years old, bright and observant in ways that both comforted and terrified their mother. They noticed when the refrigerator was nearly empty. They noticed when Sarah skipped meals and said she wasn't hungry. They noticed when she stared at the ceiling late at night, silently counting numbers that never added up. But they were still children, still capable of hope. They believed tomorrow could be better simply because it hadn't happened yet. December had been especially unforgiving. A broken car had swallowed money Sarah didn't have. A short illness had cost her days of work she couldn't afford to miss. Rent was overdue. Utilities were threatening shutoff. Every problem stacked neatly on top of the last, pressing down harder each day. By Christmas Eve, Sarah's wallet held exactly $28, money that was meant to stretch further than it ever could. Outside, the city looked nothing like her life felt. Downtown Atlanta sparkled with decorations, storefronts glowing warm and bright. Music drifted through the air. People hurried past with shopping bags and wrapped gifts, faces lit with anticipation and comfort. It was the kind of night meant for family, for full tables and laughter. For Sarah, it was a reminder of everything she was struggling to give her children. As she walked through the cold with Maya and Zoe's hands in hers, Sarah felt the familiar weight of being seen and unseen at the same time. Strangers glanced at their worn coats and thin shoes, then quickly looked away. Some looks carried pity, others carried judgment. Most carried indifference. This was the part no one talked about, the quiet side of racism and poverty, where nothing had to be said out loud for the message to be clear. Sarah told herself she wasn't asking for much, just one warm meal, just one moment where her daughters could feel normal. Christmas Eve felt like the only night she might allow herself that risk, not because it made sense, but because it mattered. Ahead of them, a diner glowed against the dark street, windows fogged with warmth and noise. Sarah had passed it countless times, always moving on, always telling herself it wasn't for people like her. Tonight, she slowed her steps. Maya and Zoe's eyes were fixed on the light spilling onto the sidewalk, their hunger written plainly on their faces. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the battle between fear and love, between responsibility and hope. Inside that diner were people with full wallets, full plates, and full lives. People who would never notice how much courage it took for a woman like Sarah to walk through those doors. People who would see her and make decisions about her in seconds. What Sarah didn't know was that the choices made that night, by strangers, by observers, by someone watching quietly from across the room, would push her life in a direction she never imagined. At that moment, Sarah believed this night would end like so many others, with survival, not relief. She had no idea that what was waiting inside wasn't just warmth or food, but a test of humanity that would expose how deeply injustice hides in everyday moments, and how one decision can change everything. Sarah stood outside the diner for several long seconds, her breath visible in the cold air, her grip tightening around her daughter's hands. She told herself she could still turn away. She could keep walking, tell the girls the buses would stop running soon, promise them something better tomorrow. She had made promises like that before. Too many. But when Maya shifted her weight and Zoe leaned closer, shivering, Sarah felt the quiet ache of a choice she had already made. She pushed the door open. Warm air rushed over them, carrying the smell of coffee, grilled bread, and cooked food that made Sarah's stomach ache instantly. The contrast was almost painful. Inside, the diner buzzed with low conversation and clinking plates. Families sat shoulder to shoulder in booths, coats draped over chair backs, laughter spilling easily from table to table. No one was rushing. No one was counting dollars. For a moment, it felt like stepping into a different world. Then the looks came. Not open hostility, not words, just quick glances that lingered a little too long, eyes that flicked from Sarah's worn coat to her daughter's thin jackets, then away again. A couple near the window leaned closer together, whispering. A man at the counter paused mid-sip, studying them with open curiosity. Sarah felt her shoulders tense, instinctively drawing inward as if she could make herself and her girls smaller. This was familiar territory. She had learned how to move through spaces like this, quietly, carefully, without attracting attention. She guided Maya and Zoe to an empty booth near the back wall, away from the center of the room. They slid into the cracked vinyl seats, their feet barely touching the floor. Sarah sat across from them, smoothing her coat, forcing her face into calm. A waitress approached and placed menus on the table without comment. Her expression was neutral, professional, but distant. Sarah thanked her anyway, her voice softer than she intended. When the waitress walked away, Sarah picked up a menu and stared at it longer than necessary. Prices blurred together. Numbers loomed larger than the words beside them. $28. The number echoed in her mind, as loudly as the holiday music playing overhead. Across the diner, conversations continued. Forks scraped plates. Someone laughed loudly near the register. Life moved forward, untouched by the quiet storm building inside Sarah's chest. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat as she calculated and recalculated, knowing there was no version of this night that didn't cost her something. What Sarah didn't realize was that she wasn't as invisible as she believed. From a corner table near the window, someone had noticed the way she held the menu without turning pages. The way her fingers slipped into her coat pocket, brushing the worn leather of her wallet again and again. The way her eyes kept flicking to her daughters instead of the food. That quiet attention, unspoken, unseen, was already setting something in motion. At that table, a decision was forming. And before Sarah could even place an order, the normal rhythm of this ordinary diner was already beginning to change, inch by inch, toward a moment that would test who people choose to see and who they choose to stand up for. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, settling over the diner like a change in temperature that only Sarah seemed to feel. While her daughters leaned forward, whispering excitedly to each other about the pictures on the menu, Sarah's eyes kept drifting to the prices. Every option felt like a risk. Every choice carried consequences she would have to face later, alone. Around them, the room continued as if nothing were wrong. Plates were delivered, coffee cups refilled, holiday music hummed softly overhead, but Sarah felt the weight of attention pressing in from every direction. She sensed it in the way conversations dipped when she shifted in her seat, in the way certain glances lingered just long enough to make her stomach knot. No one said anything outright. They didn't have to. The message was carried in silence, in posture, in the unspoken question of whether she belonged there at all. She finally made her decision, not the one her daughters hoped for, but the one she believed she could survive. When the order was placed, it was modest, careful, the kind of order that announced restraint without explaining why. As soon as the waitress walked away, Sarah felt a familiar heat rise in her chest. Shame, sharp and uninvited. She focused on her daughters' faces instead, on their patience, on the way they tried to hide their disappointment behind small smiles. That effort hurt more than any judgmental look in the room. Minutes passed slowly, too slowly. Sarah kept her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She calculated again. Bus fare, change. What might be left? What might not? The math never worked in her favor, but she repeated it anyway, as if repetition could somehow change the outcome. When the food finally arrived, relief and pain collided. The girls' faces lit up instantly, joy breaking through hunger and exhaustion. They ate quickly, carefully, as if afraid the plates might be taken away. Sarah watched them with a smile she had practiced for years, steady on the surface, cracking underneath. Her own hunger gnawed at her, but she ignored it. She always did. Across the room, eyes watched. Some diners looked away quickly, uncomfortable. Others stared openly now, curiosity sharpening into judgment. A few expressions hardened, shaped by assumptions formed long before Sarah ever walked through the door. To them, her presence wasn't just inconvenient, it disrupted the comfortable illusion of fairness they preferred not to question. At a corner table, a lone figure remained still, observing everything, not with the detached curiosity of others, but with focus. He noticed the details no one else seemed to care about. The untouched plate in front of Sarah, the way she leaned forward while her daughters ate, the tension in her shoulders that never eased. He noticed how she wiped her eyes when she thought no one was looking. That attention mattered, though Sarah had no way of knowing it yet. The check arrived sooner than she expected. It rested at the edge of the table like a verdict. Sarah's breath grew shallow. Her fingers brushed her wallet again, confirming what she already knew. She waited, counting heartbeats, bracing herself for embarrassment, for whispers, for the kind of moment that followed her home long after the night ended. Then something shifted. Movement near the counter drew attention. Chairs scraped softly. A figure rose from his seat. Several heads turned. The room seemed to pause, caught between moments. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too focused on the table, on her daughters, on the fear tightening in her chest. But others noticed. A brief exchange happened near the register, quiet but deliberate. Money changed hands. Instructions were given. A choice was made. When the waitress returned to Sarah's table, her demeanor was different. Softer, careful. Sarah's heart sank immediately. She was certain this was it, the moment when her fears would be confirmed in front of everyone. She opened the check presenter with trembling hands, already preparing herself for humiliation. What she saw didn't make sense. The numbers were gone, the balance erased. Words she wasn't expecting stared back at her, kind and final. Sarah blinked, convinced she had misunderstood. She checked again, then again. Confusion washed over her, quickly followed by disbelief. Around her, the room resumed its noise, unaware that her world had just tilted on its axis. Her daughters looked up at her, confused by the sudden change in her expression. Sarah pulled them close, overwhelmed by emotion she didn't yet understand. Relief crashed into her so suddenly it nearly stole her breath. Tears followed, hot and unstoppable. She tried to contain them, but the moment refused to stay quiet. From across the diner, the man who had stood up sat back down, watching carefully. He had no interest in recognition. This wasn't about being seen. It was about correcting something that had been wrong the moment Sarah walked in. But kindness, once revealed, has a way of drawing attention. A few tables away, someone noticed the desserts arriving. Someone noticed the extra food. Someone noticed the shift in energy around the booth in the back. And not everyone reacted with warmth. Some eyes narrowed. Some expressions twisted into something colder. What one person saw as compassion, another saw as opportunity. When Sarah and her daughters finally stood to leave, the diner felt different, warmer but also more exposed. The night outside had grown colder, the streets quieter. Snow had begun to fall, thin and steady, coating the sidewalks in white. Sarah bundled her girls close and stepped into the dark, focused on getting home before the buses stopped running. She didn't notice the movement behind her at first. Footsteps followed at a measured distance, not hurried, not accidental. Sarah sensed it anyway. The instinct that had kept her alive for years stirred sharply. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hands, her pulse pounding in her ears. The warmth of the diner faded behind them. The city that had sparkled earlier now felt hostile, empty, unforgiving. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalk. The laughter and music were gone, replaced by silence broken only by footsteps that were not hers. Sarah slowed. So did they. In that moment, she understood something with terrifying clarity. The kindness she had just received did not shield her from the world outside. The judgment hadn't disappeared, it had only changed form. And whatever was about to happen next would reveal just how dangerous it could be when prejudice, entitlement, and opportunity collided in the dark. She took a breath, positioning herself instinctively between her daughters and the threat she could now feel closing in. Behind her, the footsteps stopped, and the night held its breath. Sarah turned slowly, her body already braced before her mind could fully catch up. The street behind them was dim, the glow from the diner now distant and weak. 3 figures stood a few steps back, half-lit by a flickering street lamp. Their laughter was low, casual, the kind that carried no fear because it had never needed to. Sarah felt her stomach drop, a cold heavier than the winter air settling deep in her chest. She instinctively pulled Maya and Zoe closer, placing herself between them and the men. Years of navigating unsafe spaces had taught her this posture: protect first, ask questions later. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. She reminded herself to breathe, to stay calm. Panic, she knew, could make things worse. The men spoke casually at first, their words light, almost playful, but their tone carried an edge that made Sarah's skin crawl. They commented on the diner, on the food, on how lucky she must have been. Their eyes moved too freely, lingering on her daughters in a way that made something hot and furious rise in her chest. This wasn't about conversation. It never was. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady when she responded. She didn't raise it. She didn't challenge them. She knew how quickly situations like this could turn, how easily the wrong word could be used against her. She focused on de-escalation, on buying time, on keeping her children from hearing too much. Maya's small fingers tightened around her hand. Zoe pressed herself into Sarah's side, trembling. The men stepped closer. The space around them shrank. Snow crunched under their shoes as they moved, slow and deliberate. Sarah felt the familiar, suffocating mix of fear and anger, the anger that came from knowing this wasn't random, that this wasn't bad luck, that this moment was shaped by assumptions made long before tonight, before the diner, before Christmas Eve. Assumptions about who she was, what she had, and what could be taken from her without consequence. Her mind raced. She thought about the bus stop just blocks away, about the last bus leaving without them, about the dark apartment waiting at the end of the night. She thought about the money still in her wallet, money meant for tomorrow, for survival. She thought about how quickly everything could disappear. One of the men laughed again, louder this time. Another shifted closer, invading her space. Sarah felt the threat sharpening, turning from words into intent. Her daughters began to cry softly now, their fear no longer containable. That sound cut through Sarah like a blade. She stood her ground anyway. Her voice grew firmer, stronger than she felt. She repeated herself, telling them to step back, to leave them alone. She did not beg. She did not apologize. In that moment, something inside her hardened, not with violence but with resolve. Whatever happened next, she would not let her children see her break. The man closest to her sneered, his expression twisting with irritation at her refusal. His hand lifted just slightly. The movement was small but unmistakable. Sarah's body reacted before her thoughts did. She leaned forward, shielding Maya and Zoe completely, her heart slamming against her ribs. And then another voice cut through the night. It was calm, controlled, older but steady, the kind of voice that carried authority without shouting. The men froze. A figure stepped into the light behind them, emerging from the direction of the diner. His posture was straight despite his age, his movements deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He stopped several feet away, close enough to be heard, far enough to show he wasn't afraid. Sarah recognized him instantly, not because she knew his name, but because something about him felt familiar, like a presence she hadn't realized was still nearby. The men scoffed at first, their confidence returning in quick bursts. They laughed, mocking, dismissive. To them, this was just another obstacle, another person who didn't belong in their calculations. But the older man didn't retreat. He didn't match their aggression with anger. Instead, he stood his ground with a quiet certainty that unsettled them. He spoke again, slower this time, clear, measured, not a request. The street seemed to shrink around them, the cold pressing in as tension thickened the air. Sarah watched everything from behind her own fear, her mind split between relief that someone had stepped in and terror that the situation was escalating. She knew how dangerous it could be when egos were challenged, especially in the dark, especially when power was questioned. The men exchanged glances. One of them muttered something under his breath. Another shifted his weight, suddenly uncertain. Confidence began to crack, replaced by hesitation. The dynamic had changed and they felt it. A phone appeared in the older man's hand, not waved, not threatened, simply held, purposeful. He spoke into it calmly, as if ordering coffee instead of altering the course of the night. He gave a location. He described the situation. He ended the call without drama. The sound of distant sirens followed not long after, faint but unmistakable. Everything changed then. The men's bravado collapsed quickly. What had felt like power moments earlier now looked like panic. They backed away, muttering curses, retreating into the shadows they had emerged from. Within seconds they were gone, swallowed by the night they had tried to control. Sarah stood frozen, adrenaline still surging through her. Her daughters clung to her, sobbing quietly now that the danger had passed. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out beneath her. She hadn't realized how hard she was holding herself together until she no longer had to. The older man approached slowly, carefully, as if aware that sudden movements might frighten them further. He lowered himself slightly to the girl's level, his expression softening. His voice, when he spoke to them, carried nothing but concern. Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. The street, moments ago a place of fear, now felt strangely still, but the impact of what had just happened lingered heavily. This was no longer just about a diner or a meal or even a single act of kindness. It was about how easily dignity could be threatened, and how rare and powerful it was when someone chose to intervene. As police lights approached in the distance, Sarah realized something with painful clarity. The danger she had faced wasn't an exception. It was a consequence. And what happened next, what choices were made after this night, would determine whether this moment became another scar or the beginning of something that challenged the quiet injustice she had lived with for far too long. The arrival of the police didn't bring immediate comfort. It brought questions, flashing lights, and the sharp awareness of how fragile safety could be. Sarah felt it in the way her body refused to relax, even as the threat disappeared down the street. Her daughters' sobs slowed, but they didn't stop. Maya kept asking with her eyes whether it was truly over. Zoe clung tighter, as if letting go might summon danger back from the dark. The older man stayed close but never crowded them. He positioned himself slightly to the side, a quiet barrier between Sarah's family and the street. He watched the officers with a calm that came from experience, not arrogance. He spoke briefly, efficiently, offering details without drama. The scene resolved quickly, too quickly, Sarah thought, for something that had felt like it could end her life moments earlier. As the lights faded and the officers moved on, the cold returned. The street felt empty again, but not peaceful. Snow continued to fall, thin and relentless, collecting on Sarah's coat and the girl's hair. The city resumed its distant hum, indifferent to what had almost happened. Sarah's legs finally gave out. She sank to the curb, pulling her daughters into her arms, the strength she had borrowed finally spent. She pressed her face into their coats, breathing them in, grounding herself in the reality that they were still there, that they were safe. For now. What overwhelmed her wasn't just fear. It was the release. The weight of years spent navigating a world that asked her to be invisible and resilient at the same time. The exhaustion of constantly anticipating danger. The anger of knowing that tonight could have ended differently if a stranger hadn't chosen to care. The older man knelt nearby, careful, respectful. He didn't rush her. He didn't demand gratitude. He waited until her breathing steadied, until the shaking slowed. His presence felt solid, anchored, like someone who understood that moments like this needed space, not solutions. When Sarah finally looked up, her eyes met his. She saw something there she hadn't expected: recognition. Not pity, not superiority. Recognition that crossed the distance between their lives without erasing it. Whatever he saw in her, it wasn't weakness. The girls, still pressed close, watched him cautiously. Fear lingered in their faces, but curiosity edged its way back in. He acknowledged them first, lowering himself again to their level, his expression gentle, steady. He checked for injuries, for anything that might have been missed in the chaos. He made sure they were warm enough. These were small gestures, but they mattered. Sarah realized then that the night had layered meaning upon meaning. The diner, the kindness, the threat, the intervention. Each moment peeled back another layer of the same truth she had lived with for years, that injustice didn't always announce itself loudly. Often it whispered, it lingered, it waited for moments of vulnerability. A patrol car returned, slower this time. An offer was made: safe transport home. Sarah hesitated. Accepting help had never been easy. Every part of her had been trained to manage alone, to avoid attention, to decline anything that might later be used against her. But tonight had already stripped away the illusion of control. She nodded, prioritizing her daughters over pride. As they settled into the back seat, warmth finally enveloped them. The heater hummed. Maya's breathing slowed first, exhaustion overtaking fear. Zoe followed soon after, her head heavy against Sarah's shoulder. Sarah watched their faces soften in sleep, relief washing over her in quiet waves. Through the window, she saw the older man standing alone under the streetlight, snow dusting his coat. He didn't wave. He didn't follow. He simply watched as the car pulled away, as if ensuring that this part of the story reached safety before he let go of it. The ride home felt longer than usual. The streets grew rougher. Lights dimmed. Buildings sagged under neglect. When they arrived, the apartment complex looked exactly as it always had: cold, worn, unforgiving. The officer's concern was visible but brief. This was not unfamiliar territory. Inside, the apartment greeted them with silence and cold. Sarah tucked the girls into bed, layering blankets, checking doors and windows twice. She sat beside them, listening to their breathing, replaying the night again and again. Each replay carried a new realization. Kindness had changed the course of her evening. It had not changed the system that put her in danger. The same judgment still existed. The same risks waited tomorrow. And yet something had shifted inside her. Not hope, not yet, but awareness sharpened by experience. Across the city, the older man stood awake in a home filled with light and emptiness. The night refused to release him. The image of Sarah shielding her children replayed in his mind with the same intensity. He had spent decades believing that distance made generosity efficient. Tonight had proven otherwise. Two lives had brushed against the same injustice from opposite sides, and neither of them would sleep easily. Because what began as a single act of kindness had exposed something far larger, an uncomfortable truth neither could ignore. And as dawn approached, decisions were forming quietly, deliberately, setting the stage for a confrontation not just with circumstance, but with a society that allowed moments like this to exist at all. The rising tension had not ended. It had only changed direction. Sleep didn't come easily for Sarah that night. Even after exhaustion finally pulled her under, her body remained tense, as if danger might still slip through the cracks of the dark apartment. She woke at the smallest sound, the hum of passing cars, a shout somewhere in the distance, the creak of the building settling in the cold. Each time she reached instinctively for her daughters, reassured only when she felt their warmth and heard their steady breathing. Morning arrived gray and quiet. Christmas Day. No music, no wrapping paper, no tree, just the same walls, the same worries, and a heaviness that settled in Sarah's chest as she sat on the edge of the bed watching Maya and Zoe sleep. The events of the night before replayed in fragments. The diner lights, the looks, the footsteps, the voice that cut through the dark. Part of her wondered if it had all been some strange dream born of exhaustion and fear. But the ache in her body, and the memory of real terror, told her it was. As the girls woke, their questions came gently. They didn't ask about the men. They didn't ask about the fear. Children learned early which questions might break something fragile. Instead, they asked about breakfast, about school, about whether Christmas still counted if there were no presents. Sarah answered as best she could, her voice steady even as her mind raced ahead to the week to come. Rent, work, food, survival. The familiar cycle waited patiently for her return. Yet something inside her resisted slipping back into routine so easily. Throughout the day, moments from the night surfaced unexpectedly. When she counted out coins for groceries, she remembered the judgment in the diner. When she walked past strangers on the street, she felt again the awareness of being watched. The fear hadn't vanished, it had sharpened. It reminded her that vulnerability wasn't just about money. It was about how quickly safety could be stripped away when others decided you were expendable. Across the city, the older man experienced a different kind of unrest. He moved through his spacious home without purpose, every room echoing with absence. The city outside buzzed with celebration, but none of it reached him. He replayed the moment he stepped into the street, the look in Sarah's eyes when she realized she wasn't alone. He had acted without thinking, driven by instinct and something deeper he hadn't felt in years. Now reflection followed. He recognized the truth he could no longer ignore, that what he had witnessed wasn't rare. It wasn't extraordinary. It was simply invisible to those who never had to live it. The diner had been comfortable for everyone else because they had never been forced to question whether they belonged there. The street had felt dangerous to Sarah because history had taught her it often was. That realization unsettled him more than any threat from the night before. Days passed, but the tension lingered like an unresolved note. Sarah returned to work, exhaustion etched deeper into her face. She moved through hospital halls filled with suffering, offering care she herself rarely received. Each interaction carried new weight. She noticed how some patients were treated differently, how assumptions followed people like shadows. She had always known this, but now the knowledge felt heavier, sharpened by what had nearly happened to her children. At night, she checked locks twice. She avoided certain streets. She replayed decisions endlessly, questioning whether she had done something wrong by simply existing in a space not designed to welcome her. The memory of the man who intervened remained vivid, not as a savior but as proof. Proof that choice mattered, that silence enabled harm, that action, even from someone unexpected, could disrupt the worst outcomes. Unbeknownst to Sarah, decisions were being made elsewhere. Quiet phone calls, requests for information, a growing determination to understand the life that had intersected so suddenly with his own. The older man felt compelled not by guilt, but by responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge what he had seen and what he had ignored for too long. Two paths, still separate, were beginning to curve toward one another again. And as the days edged closer to a meeting neither of them anticipated, the underlying tension grew, not from fear this time, but from the weight of possibility. Because confronting injustice didn't end with stopping one dangerous moment. It demanded something far more difficult. It demanded change. And the rising action was far from over. The moment Sarah stepped into the downtown office tower, she felt the weight of every place she had never been allowed to belong. The polished marble floors reflected her image back at her, tired eyes borrowed confidence, a woman carrying invisible scars into a world built to pretend they didn't exist. Conversations softened as she passed. Eyes followed, some curious, some dismissive, none neutral. This wasn't the diner anymore. This was power. She told herself to breathe. She reminded herself she was here for a reason. Still, every step forward felt like a test she hadn't studied for. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was polite but cold. Executives sat upright, hands folded, expressions measured. Papers were stacked neatly in front of them. Numbers, projections, sanitized versions of lives reduced to bullet points. Sarah recognized the look immediately. It was the same one she had seen from hospital administrators explaining budget cuts while nurses burned out. The same one she had seen from landlords explaining rent increases to tenants who had nowhere else to go. Professional concern without personal cost. As the discussion began, words like outreach, community, and impact filled the room. They sounded generous, progressive, safe. But as Sarah listened, something twisted in her chest. The language was distant, abstract. It spoke about people like her without ever speaking to them. She raised her hand. The room paused. It was a small action, but it carried risk. She felt it immediately. The subtle tightening, the shift in posture, the unspoken question of whether she had earned the right to speak here. When she did, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled beneath the table. She didn't talk about statistics. She talked about fear. She described walking home at night knowing that one wrong encounter could end everything. She spoke about judgment that arrived before words were ever exchanged, about how dignity could disappear in seconds. She talked about her daughters, how they learned silence before safety, caution before trust. The room grew quiet. Too quiet. Some faces softened, others hardened. A man near the far end of the table leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening. He didn't interrupt, but his eyes carried something sharp. Calculation. Resistance. When Sarah finished, there was a pause that felt endless. Then the questions came. They were framed as curiosity, but they landed like challenges. Was she being emotional? Was her experience isolated? Did she understand how complex systemic issues were? Did she realize that personal stories could cloud objective decision-making? Sarah felt the familiar heat rise again, not shame this time, but anger. She answered carefully, thoughtfully, but each response chipped away at her restraint, because she knew what was happening. She had lived it her entire life. When marginalized voices spoke truth too clearly, the room found ways to shrink them back down. Across the table, the older man watched everything. He had invited Sarah here to speak, to be heard. But now he saw the walls closing in. He recognized the pattern he had once benefited from, the way power protected itself by calling injustice complicated, by labeling pain as anecdotal. He stood. The movement was sudden, decisive, chairs shifted, conversation stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply spoke with a clarity that cut through the room like a blade. He said that if truth made them uncomfortable, then discomfort was overdue. That if lived experience threatened their models, then their models were incomplete. That what happened to Sarah wasn't an exception. It was the consequence of silence. The room fractured. Some executives looked away. Others stared openly, stunned. The man at the far end of the table finally spoke, his tone tight, defensive. He warned about optics, about donors, about reputation. That was when the older man said the words that changed everything. He said that if protecting comfort required ignoring reality, then comfort was the problem. Silence fell hard. Sarah felt her breath catch. She realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a line being drawn between image and truth, between performative justice and real accountability. And she knew, with sudden clarity, that what happened next would determine whether this institution truly stood for change, or whether it would crush the very voices it claimed to uplift. No one spoke. Then the board chair cleared his throat. And the decision began. The board chair's voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words carried weight. He spoke about procedure, about governance, about taking time to consider implications. The language was careful, rehearsed. It was the sound of power buying itself breathing room. Sarah felt the shift immediately. This was the moment she had feared, not open rejection, but slow suffocation. The kind that wrapped itself in professionalism and called it fairness. She had seen it before at the hospital when staff complaints disappeared into committees. She had seen it in housing offices where promises dissolved into paperwork. Delay was denial with a softer face. Her heart pounded, but she stayed still. Around the table, reactions fractured. One executive nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing costs and benefits. Another avoided eye contact entirely. A woman near the window pressed her lips together, clearly torn. The man who had questioned Sarah earlier crossed his arms, his posture defensive now, as if bracing for a loss of control. The older man remained standing. He listened as the board chair continued, outlining next steps, future reviews, potential pilot programs. Words stacked neatly, building a wall between intention and action. Sarah realized something in that moment that hit harder than fear. This room had the power to change lives immediately, and it was choosing not to. Her chest tightened. She thought of that night again, the diner, the street, the way danger had escalated not because of chaos but because no one intervened until the last possible second. This felt the same, different setting, same pattern. She spoke again, before she could second-guess herself. Her voice was quieter this time, but it carried. She said she understood caution. She understood complexity. She lived inside it every day. But she asked them a single question: how many families would be harmed while they considered implications? How many children would learn fear before safety? How many nights like hers were acceptable losses in the name of order? No one answered. The silence was heavier now, charged. The board chair shifted in his seat. The man with crossed arms leaned forward, irritation flashing across his face. He warned that emotional appeals could not dictate policy, that institutions survived on structure, not sentiment, that they had a responsibility to protect the foundation from controversy. That word landed hard. Controversy. Sarah felt something break open inside her, not loudly, not violently, but completely. She realized then that to them, her life was a risk factor. Her truth was a liability. Before she could respond, the older man spoke again. This time his voice was not just firm, it was final. He said that he had built his career believing structure prevented chaos. That distance ensured efficiency. That writing checks absolved responsibility. And he admitted plainly that he had been wrong. He said the greatest controversy wasn't public criticism. It was moral failure disguised as neutrality. Several heads snapped up. He continued, saying that if the foundation existed only to feel good about helping without actually doing it, then it had lost its purpose. He said change could not be outsourced to time, that justice delayed was not patience, it was cowardice. The room reacted all at once. A murmur spread, discomfort rippled. Someone whispered urgently to the person beside them. The board chair attempted to interject, but the older man didn't stop. He reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table. Inside were documents, commitments, funding reallocation, structural changes, not proposals, decisions. He said that effective immediately, the foundation would shift resources directly into community-led programs. That leadership would include people who lived the realities they claimed to address. That Sarah's role was not symbolic, it was central, and that anyone unwilling to stand behind that vision was free to step aside. The implication was unmistakable. Resign or evolve. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't asked for it. She felt the weight of the room tilt sharply, power rebalancing in real time. This wasn't charity. This was confrontation. The man who had challenged her earlier stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. He accused the older man of emotional decision-making, of risking decades of reputation. He warned of donor backlash, media scrutiny, instability. The older man met his gaze evenly. He said stability built on exclusion was already broken. That was the moment. The board chair called for order, but it was too late. Lines had been drawn, positions revealed. What had begun as a discussion was now a reckoning. This institution could not return to polite abstraction. It had been forced to choose. Sarah sat frozen, heart racing. She realized she was witnessing something rare, power being challenged from the inside, not for applause but for alignment. Votes were called. Hands rose slowly, hesitantly at first. Then more followed. Some stayed down, some rose late. Each one felt like a drumbeat echoing through the room. The decision passed, but narrowly. Relief and shock collided in Sarah's chest. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. She knew this wasn't victory. It was exposure, and exposure invited backlash. As the meeting adjourned, tension hung thick in the air. People avoided one another. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Sarah gathered her things slowly, aware that eyes were still on her, but differently now, not just judging. Calculating. As she stepped into the hallway, the older man joined her. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't soften the moment. He simply said that change never arrived cleanly, and that resistance would follow. Sarah nodded. She felt it too. Because while one injustice had been confronted openly, others had just been provoked. And as the elevator doors closed, sealing her inside, she understood with chilling clarity. The hardest part wasn't standing up. It was surviving what came after. It arrived quietly at first, slipping into the cracks of the following days like a cold draft no one could fully shut out. Emails circulated behind closed doors. Meetings were rescheduled, then canceled. Conversations stopped when Sarah entered rooms. Smiles became careful. Compliments became conditional. She felt it immediately, the shift from invited voice to disruptive presence. This was the price of being heard. At work, whispers followed her down hallways. Some praised her courage in private, eyes darting nervously as they spoke. Others avoided her entirely, as if proximity alone could cost them something. The institution had voted for change, but institutions did not move as one body. They fractured. They resisted. They pushed back. And the pressure began to build. News leaked. Not the full truth, never that, just enough to frame the story in safer terms. Headlines softened the conflict, stripping it of race, of fear, of lived reality. They focused on internal disagreements, on strategic differences, on a billionaire making unexpected changes. Sarah's name appeared briefly, carefully, without context. A token mention, a footnote. Online commentary followed. Some praised the shift, others mocked it. Words like handout, overreaction, agenda surfaced quickly. Sarah read comments she knew weren't meant for her eyes but were written about people exactly like her. The same judgments she had felt in the diner now multiplied, amplified by distance and anonymity. Her phone buzzed constantly. Support mixed with hostility, encouragement tangled with warnings. Someone sent her a message telling her to be grateful and quiet. Another told her she was brave but foolish. One message simply said she should watch her back. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She lay awake listening to her daughters breathe, the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. She wondered if she had gone too far, if she had put herself and them at risk. She had wanted change. She had not anticipated exposure. Across the city, the older man faced his own storm. Donors called. Advisors warned him. Longtime partners questioned his judgment. He was told he was risking legacy for ideology, that he was allowing emotion to override reason. Some hinted that stepping back now could preserve everything he had built. He listened. Then he refused. For the first time in decades, he felt aligned. The discomfort did not frighten him, it clarified him. He recognized the familiar tactics: isolate the problem, personalize the blame, exhaust the people pushing for change until they retreated. He had once benefited from that machinery. He would not again. But the institution pushed harder. A closed-door meeting was called. This time, Sarah wasn't invited. She found out afterward. The message was clear without being spoken. This is where your influence ends. Something in her snapped, not in anger but in resolve. She requested to speak at the next full assembly. The request was delayed, then denied, too soon, too sensitive, too volatile, the same words dressed up in different clothes. Sarah understood the pattern now. The injustice wasn't just in moments of danger on dark streets. It lived here too, in polished rooms and professional language. It thrived when discomfort was labeled disruption, when truth was tolerated only until it demanded sacrifice. So she made a different choice. She spoke publicly. Not with accusations, not with names, with truth. She shared her story, not just the diner, not just the street, but the aftermath. The way systems closed ranks. The way voices were invited only until they challenged control. She spoke about racism not as an isolated act, but as a network of silences, incentives, and fears. The response was immediate. Support surged, loud, visible, undeniable. Community leaders reached out. Families shared their own stories. Media outlets requested interviews. The narrative shifted slowly, imperfectly, but perceptibly. And with it came consequences. The institution was forced into the light. Internal divisions became public. Board members resigned. Others doubled down. Funding wavered. Staff morale fractured. What had once been a controlled environment now faced scrutiny it could no longer manage quietly. Sarah stood at the center of it, not because she sought attention, but because the truth had momentum. Then came the call. Late, unexpected. She listened in silence as the voice on the other end spoke carefully, formally. They expressed concern. They spoke of reputation, of alignment, of moving forward together. And then they made it clear. If Sarah continued publicly, her role would be reconsidered. It wasn't a threat. It was leverage. Sarah ended the call without responding. She sat alone in her apartment, city lights flickering through the window, the weight of the choice pressing down on her. Stability or integrity, safety or truth. She thought of her daughters, what they had seen, what they had learned, what they would remember. She remembered the night in the diner. The night someone stood up. Her phone buzzed again. A message from the older man, short, unfiltered. Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. Sarah closed her eyes. She knew then that this was the true climax, not a meeting, not a vote, not a headline, but the moment where fear and purpose stood face to face, demanding a choice. By morning, that choice would reshape more than her own life. And when the sun rose, the world would see whether this story ended in compromise or in transformation. Morning arrived quietly without ceremony. The city moved as it always did, Buses ran, offices opened, people hurried past one another carrying their own invisible burdens. But for Sarah, the world felt different now. Not softer, not safer, just clearer. She stood at the kitchen window watching the light creep across the buildings outside, her daughters still asleep behind her. The night before had left her exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. The choice she had made, to speak, to refuse silence, had closed some doors forever, but it had opened something else inside her, a steadiness she hadn't felt before. Not hope exactly, but resolve. She thought back to the moment everything changed. Not the meeting, not the headlines, but the diner. The way fear had wrapped itself around her chest as she counted dollars under the table. The way judgment had followed her without words. The way danger had appeared so easily, so casually, the moment she stepped outside the warmth and light. That night had taught her something brutal and undeniable. Racism didn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it waited patiently, confident it would be protected by silence. The days that followed were not simple or triumphant. There were no neat endings, no sudden justice. Instead, there was work. Hard, grinding, emotionally costly work. Sarah lost her position with the institution just as she had suspected she might. The decision was framed politely, wrapped in language about alignment and direction, but she understood what it was. Standing up had consequences. Yet something unexpected happened next. The calls didn't stop. Community organizations reached out, groups that didn't operate from towers of glass and steel, but from church basements, shared offices, borrowed spaces. People who had lived the same realities Sarah had spoken about wanted her voice, her leadership, her truth. Not as a symbol, but as a guide. She began working alongside them, not behind polished desks, but in neighborhoods where fear wasn't theoretical, where mothers planned their routes home carefully, where children learned early which places welcomed them and which didn't. She listened more than she spoke. She learned. She helped connect resources directly to people who needed them, without gatekeeping, without performance. The work was messy, imperfect, real. And slowly, Sarah began to see something shift, not in the world all at once, but in pockets of it. Families received help without humiliation. Voices were amplified instead of filtered. Stories were told fully, not edited down to comfort those in power. At home, change came quietly too. Maya and Zoe slept more soundly, not because the world had become safe, but because their mother no longer carried everything alone. They asked questions about fairness, about kindness, about why some people were treated differently. Sarah answered honestly, gently, refusing to shield them with lies but determined not to harden them with fear. She taught them this, that dignity is not something you earn, it's something you are born with. And that when the world tries to take it from you, standing up is not disrespect, it's survival. Across the city, the older man faced the consequences of his own choices. He lost donors, he lost allies, he lost the comfort of neutrality he had lived inside for decades. But what he gained was something he hadn't felt since his wife was alive, purpose rooted in action, not abstraction. He redirected resources into places he had once avoided. He showed up in rooms where his presence made others uncomfortable, and he stayed. He listened to voices he had once delegated to reports and summaries. He didn't attempt to lead those spaces. He supported them. When asked why he hadn't taken the easier path, he gave a simple answer. Because comfort had cost too much. The story spread, not as a viral moment that burned bright and disappeared, but as a slow, persistent reminder. People debated it, argued over it. Some dismissed it. Others recognized themselves in it, painfully so. And that was the point. Because this was never just Sarah's story. It was the story of countless people who navigate the world carrying fear quietly, so others don't have to feel uncomfortable. It was the story of injustice that doesn't always leave bruises, but leaves scars just as deep. It was the story of how systems protect themselves by calling suffering complicated, by asking the oppressed to be patient, polite, grateful. It was also the story of choice. The choice to look away or to see. The choice to stay silent or to intervene. The choice to preserve comfort or to pursue justice, even when it costs something. Sarah's life did not become perfect. Challenges remained. The world did not suddenly become fair, but something fundamental had changed. She no longer questioned whether she belonged. She no longer mistook silence for safety. She no longer believed that surviving quietly was the same as living freely. And for everyone who watched her story unfold, a question lingered, uncomfortable, unavoidable, necessary. How many moments like this happen every day without witnesses? How many people walk into danger simply because the world has decided not to see them? And when the moment comes, when silence becomes a choice, what will you do? Because racism doesn't survive on hatred alone. It survives on indifference. And the story doesn't end when the credits roll. It continues every time someone chooses to stand up or chooses not to. The difference is everything.